Today on The State of Us, an elite school, a suicide, and a question of blame, the science of reading. The New York Times reports that in suburban Houston, parents rose up against a top-rated school district demanding an entirely new reading curriculum. Also from the Times, an elite school, a suicide, and a question of blame. Grieving parents sue to compel changes in policies that cover mental health issues. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal, and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson.
Get to talk about reading, one of my favorite things to do, and very important. I think everybody agrees as far as learning things, right? Whether you're in school or out of school, reading is the key to doing almost anything. So you mean there's a real way to go about the better way of teaching? It's been an issue within education, folks, for as long as I can remember. And my mom was a reading teacher. So basically my entire 62 years have been involved with reading. And the other one is just a very sad situation. And we'll talk more about it later, as far as you send your kids to a private school, yet your children still have issues. So yeah, maybe it's not necessarily the type of school you send your children to.
So the article about reading tells us that, quote, the movement under the banner of the science of reading is targeting the education establishment, school districts, literacy gurus, publishers, and colleges of education, which critics say have failed to embrace the cognitive science of how children learn to read. Research shows that most children need systematic, sound-it-out instruction, also known as phonics, as well as other direct support like building vocabulary and expanding students' knowledge of the world.
They haven't reinvented the wheel. It's not anything new as far as teaching reading, but it's what we always did when you looked at, you know, A, E, I, O, and U, and the different sounds they could make. And if they were followed, you know, a vowel was followed by another vowel, then it was made an O sound. And I used to start every day, and this is tough because we're not visual here, but I would put a word on the board spelled G-H-O-T-I and ask my students what it was. And, you know, I taught high school kids and all kinds of guesses. Nobody got it. And then I would write underneath, this is the word fish spelled in the English language. And they go, fish, right? Because you take the word enough, all right, at the end there's an F sound, and it's the letters G-H. So G-H in G-H-O-T-I becomes F. The O, well, we have the word women. So the O in women has an I sound. And then T-I, if you have education, the SH sound comes from the letter combination T-I. So G-H-O-T-I spells fish phonetically. So, but again, it was to teach everybody that within the English language, we have different combinations. That's why English is very hard to learn, because we have different sounds for using letter combinations. That's how we come up with things. But once you understand that, then anything you put in front of yourself, as far as the written word, you can figure it out. Okay. But there was this movement in the late 60s, early 70s, where we were going to teach the sight method of reading. And that is, your teacher handed you a list of words, and you knew that the word B-A-T was bat. You didn't know that B made the B sound, and the A was a short A, and the T made T, but you just knew that B-A-T was bat. So anytime you saw B-A-T, you knew bat, 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 okay? But what if the word was C-A-T? You're like, oh, crap. I don't know.
Well, I've never seen that word.
I've never seen that word before. It's not on my word list. That was sight reading. And we did that for a long time. And yours truly ranted and raved against it, and we messed up a lot of kids. A lot of young people trying to teach them to read using the sight method.
You might say, why should I care? Or is this really a problem? Well, about 1 in 3 children in the United States cannot read at a basic level of comprehension.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad, right? I mean, that's basic. And we said at the beginning of the show, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. You can't do anything if you don't know how to read. I can't put you on the job on how to install a door if you can't read the instructions. I mean, you can't sit at your computer and answer emails if you can't read the language.
The outcomes are particularly troubling for Black and Native American children, nearly half of whom score below basic by 8th grade. These kids can't read. Nobody wants to just say that, according to an activist with the NAACP in Oakland, California. A popular method of teaching known as, quote, balanced literacy has focused less on phonics and more on developing a love of books and ensuring students understand the meaning of stories. At times, it has included dubious strategies like guiding children to guess words from pictures. The push for reform picked up in 2019 when national reading scores showed significant improvement in just 2 places, Mississippi and Washington, D.C., both had required more phonics. But what had remained a niche education issue was supercharged by a storm of events, a pandemic that mobilized parents, COVID relief money that gave school districts flexibility to change, a fresh spotlight on racial disparities after the murder of George Floyd, and a hit education podcast with a passionate following. Can such a sprawling, enthusiastic movement stick to the science across thousands of schools and classrooms? Can real change be executed and sustained? In 2000, at the behest of Congress, a national reading panel recommended many strategies being argued for today, and the Bush administration prioritized phonics. Yet the effort faltered because of politics and bureaucratic snafus. Today's movement, though, is less top-down and far more dynamic. Perhaps the perfect storm has arrived. One thing I guess I wanted to mention is they talk about the terms I have problems with because I think they're misleading terms. You could say it's the science of reading because it's what we know is proven to work. And I guess I'm okay with it from that standpoint. Part of what the article talks about is the programs that are seeing success prioritize phonics, right? But they also, and this is what you have to read the full, because it's a long article, folks, but you have to read the full article to get this. They also work to foster a love of reading and an understanding of stories. You know, again, time and again, research shows us how many people like to be made to do something that they don't know how to do. No one likes that. And it makes anybody uncomfortable, anxious, and averse to doing a thing. So if you don't know how to do a thing or you don't know how to do it well, you're not likely to want to do that thing, especially if you're being assessed on it, right? So we're going to grade you on something that you're really bad at that you don't like doing. Oh boy, you know, I'm super excited now. No. So you have to know how to do it, but you also have to enjoy doing it. And I think that's part of what's been missed is we said, well, you know, phonics isn't particularly enjoyable activity, so we're just going to basically mostly do away with that. And now we're just going to focus on, you know, getting kids this feeling of success by rote memorization of words and picture association. And then we'll talk to them about the meaning of story, and it doesn't really matter whether or not they read it exactly right because we'll just go over it with them and make sure they understand the meaning. So that way they like the story and that way they have a positive, you know, but again,
they feel good about literature because they now they know all these stories and they've learned all the meanings of these stories and what the author said, but they can't sit down and read the story themselves.
So you have to rely on somebody else to make sure that you quote unquote know what the story meant. And I think that plenty of people who love great literature would tell you that you can't hardly ever can you pin down a single meaning of great literary works. Part of what makes them great is that there's a degree of interpretation to what you're reading. And so, you know, to say that, well, it means this can shortchange it. And if you don't know how to read well and you don't enjoy reading, then I don't know how you're supposed to you're never really going to love reading. Maybe you appreciate stories and literacy, but you can't actually do it yourself. So you're never going to grow past what you were told in school, which then leads to, again, negative association with reading for your whole life. And what does that do to everything? Your prospects. I mean, 200 years ago, most people in this country couldn't read. So now you change that and you say, okay, well, most of us can, and we expect it, right? I mean, it is an expected workforce ability to be able to do that. And we just said that 1 in 3 children in the United States cannot read at a basic level of comprehension, according to the most recent national surveys.
Well, and I remember when we started to switch a little bit from the phonics, and there were a series of articles out of the major cities. I think one of them was San Francisco. And there were young people that were graduating from high school who couldn't read. I think the name of the book, I can't remember the author, but it was Johnny Can't Read. And we were actually graduating people in the 70s from high school who couldn't read. Well, instead of finding out why that was going on, we said, well, it's because phonics aren't working. So we went to new ways to try to make sure kids would read. And now many states, Ohio included, has an early education reading requirement. We give a 3rd or 4th grade test, and students have to be able to read at that level. If not, then all these things are put in place because by that time they should learn to read. So there was a problem, but rather than finding out what the problem was, we just threw different things at it. And now we're coming back around to saying, oh, well, if these kids were graduating from high school in the 70s and couldn't read, it wasn't because of phonics. It was probably because of something else, because the science now tells us that phonics, along with these other things, is the best way to teach the majority of students. So we had an issue. We got all scared about it. And instead of finding out why people were graduating without the ability to read, we just changed the whole system. And we ended up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we've now come full circle, and we're going to at least maybe begin to emphasize, phonics again. But now here's the rub, and it doesn't really address this in the article. How many school districts have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on curriculum that doesn't have to do with phonics? And now they're going to be asked to throw all their new material, quote, new material out that was this love of reading and nurturing and understanding. They're going to have to throw all of those textbooks out and now buy new curriculum that teaches phonics. Now you've made it very difficult on the teachers. They're scrambling because now they have to go out and spend money on their own or find other things to teach this new curriculum because the district can't afford new school books.
What do we do about this? Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Miss Calkins is an elementary school teacher in Hutchinson, Minnesota, and a veteran who is crusading for reform, haunted by the fear that for 28 years she failed children because she was not trained in the cognitive science behind reading. Miss Calkins rewrote early literacy curriculum last year to include for the first time daily structured phonics to be used with the whole class. In a statement, she said she had always treated phonics as critical, but she added, quote, "To reduce the teaching of reading to phonics instruction and nothing more is to misunderstand what reading is and what learning is. These arguments have been made for a long time by a lot of people," said the chair of the NAACP in Fairfax County, Virginia. But new pressure has been brought up, as we've talked about throughout this, that what we've learned, right, is we've done sort of the pendulum swing. And phonics are important to being able to enjoy reading because being able to enjoy reading means being decent at it.
And being able to read by yourself.
Right. Yeah, if somebody has to stand there and constantly explain it to you, again, like we talked about in the first segment, not only do people not like to do things they're bad at, people also don't like to be made to feel stupid, and if the only way you can read is by asking somebody, every minute, every page, well, I think it meant this. Does it mean this? Because you don't know, that's not going to build a lot of confidence.
And if you're guessing
either.
at the word and you guess the wrong word, it could give a whole entirely different meaning to the events that you're reading about.
Right. Yeah. And then how do you do on the test or assessment? Because what you thought you read versus what you actually read were not the same thing. Same thing with, once you're out in the workforce, right? Misinterpretation or misunderstanding because of lack of reading comprehension, or failure to get your training done properly. Or, again, it all goes back to everything we've talked about. One of the perhaps, and we don't know for sure, right? But perhaps one of the biggest reasons that we have trouble with test scores, particularly in science and American history, is partly because reading is so bad. If you can't read and you're being handed a textbook that's at the 9th grade level and you're in 9th grade, but you're reading at the 6th grade level, what's the likelihood that you're really going to be able to learn from that 9th grade level book?
Well, do you really understand the question?
Well, right. That's what I mean.
So now you go back through the reading to find the answer.
You don't understand the question and you don't understand the reading. Yeah. It's
and not because you don't understand science.
Right.
But because you can't read.
You're capable of understanding the science, but you're not capable of comprehending the question, potentially the question, and how to figure out the answer to the question because it's written in a way that you are not yet capable of reading.
Well, talking to my friends who still teach English, they get papers now turned in by students that have texting shorthand in them.
Well, and the crazy thing is
because the kids,
some of those they're not even, we being, millennials, boomers, older generations often refer to those things as shorthands. But there was an interesting article recently where they surveyed a lot of students and found out that a lot of students couldn't tell you what the quote unquote shorthand actually stood for. They could explain like what it means, right? Like why you might use it. But like as these have actually become like vocabulary words for them, they're words, and they're not words that you can pronounce either.
Right. Like BTW, by the way.
Right.
Instead of writing by the way, they just text BTW. That's one that I know.
But you can
LOL, right? Laugh out loud.
Right.
I'm old. Those are the two that I know. But they'll write that now in a formal paper, in a formal essay that they're going to turn in. And it's like, these aren't, to your point, these aren't words.
Right. Yeah.
But to them, this is how
they are words.
This is how they express themselves in their everyday talking on the phone through, texting. And then it becomes part of the vocabulary. But then now what does that do with their ability to read when they read the classics or the newspaper or something, an instructional manual
or a email note from a colleague? One of my big things is, and I don't know that there's a right answer to this, folks, but emojis, right, have become incredibly popular, and they have been now for probably about a decade. Why did emojis come about? Well, they came about because we basically figured out via digital communication that it was easy to misinterpret people. Is the misinterpretation because we're bad at writing or we're bad at reading, or because digital communication is inherently fraught for interpretation? The last one is only true if the first two are true. And if we're bad at writing, it's probably partly because we're bad at reading. You can be, right? The English language has a great degree of ways to express oneself via words. And we found that a lot of contextual errors were made.
Can I just throw one more thing? And punctuation.
Well, yes, that's what I guess I should say.
Words and punctuation.
Yes.
Where you put things.
Sentence structure, punctuation, right? Things that.
The whole writing process
The whole writing process, the difference between there being a comma versus no comma and how that could totally change the tone.
But then that's reading.
The sentence.
Because if you read, then you're supposed to read straight through, which then changes the meaning. Or are you supposed to hesitate, pause, and then that changes the meaning that comes after it? Anyway.
But to that point of, so why did emojis come about? And I guess I'm saying part of why is we're increasing the rate at which the average person is writing and reading, right? You're doing it more because that's part of the way we're communicating. You don't necessarily have to call somebody. You can send them a text. All of these things that we found, right, that are this is efficient. It improves. Sometimes it's not necessary to call somebody. I just need to send them a quick note. But then we also find that people are misinterpreting what I said, or they're assuming that I said it with a certain tone, or whatever, right? And so our solution to that, rather than saying we need to be better readers and we need to be better writers, is we need to provide a way to communicate the tone and emotion of something, a simple way.
Then what happens to our abilities to read?
Well, right. The whole thing of if you don't use a skill, what
we make
happens?
it easier, right? You just said we're making it easier since we can't do these things. Well, that means we're not doing those things even more.
And that's part of what I'm contending, is that the presence and existence of emojis, while the thought should make it easier for us to convey meaning and tone, actually make us worse readers and worse, therefore, writers, because we don't have to use certain skills in that context. The last time we talked about education is the answer. Well, there's too many kids of diverse backgrounds have a hard time, getting into more competitive schools. So the answer is that we will make it easier to get into competitive schools. No, the answer is that we need to do a better job of helping them meet the requirements, right? It's a raise the lowest common denominator. Don't lower it. And I think that's some of what we've accidentally done as a society in reading. And we have to ask ourselves, is that what we want? The chances that text are going away as a matter of digital communication is, probably not likely anytime soon.
We come back to the same functionality as why do we introduce anything else in schools until children can read? I mean, why not just say, science, social studies, okay, math, maybe a little bit, you could do the math. But other than reading and math, right? We go back to the 3 R's. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Is there anything else? I mean, if you don't...
Is there a reason to teach anything else until you can do those things?
Right. If you don't have those skills, are you just spinning your wheels to teach anything else?
And wasting money.
Right. Now...
Because how effective...
Do you do music and arts? Yes, because that develops the synapses in the brain that make it easier to learn how to read and write.
Improves connections.
Exactly. And you still have to let the kids go out and have recess because physical exercise helps our brain decide to learn as well. I mean, how many times, I know, Justin, you read like I do. We're sitting there reading and all of a sudden the words become a blur. So we get up, go get a drink of water. We go walk out and get the mail, whatever. And we come back down and read. Now we can read better. That all proves that, young people need recess. They need to get up, move around.
Adults need recess.
Right.
So why would we think that kids don't?
But we take those things out because all of a sudden we want more instructional minutes. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily lead to more learning.
It doesn't lead to, yeah.
But the fundamental thing is, if we don't teach kids to read, they're less likely to be successful later on.
But the last thing on the reading note is the institution of curriculum. I just want to put that out there for people to chew on. There was a time where we relied more on teachers to build a curriculum rather than buy a curriculum. And I think it's possible that we've done a disservice to teachers and students by removing that. Because if you didn't make the curriculum, how passionate are you going to be about it? Now, if you find a curriculum, right, that's like, man, I could have written this because this is really good. But if a curriculum director chooses a curriculum and then says, this is what we're all going to teach, and we've talked about the variety of teachers that exist, are we accidentally predispositioning our teachers to not deliver curriculum effectively because you're giving them a curriculum that they're not going to be able to deliver as effectively as another curriculum?
We've talked about this, that in a big school, one of my former students is a geometry teacher. There are 6 geometry teachers for sophomores, in this high school, what's the likelihood that all 6 of those teachers teach geometry exactly the same? And does the student get the same experience? So then I agree with you, but I'm defending the curriculum director. What do you do in that case? If students sit in Mr. Jackson's history class and get a level of history, one level, and they sit in Mr. Smith's class, let's say, and they get a different level, is that the curriculum or is that the teacher?
You want to talk about all the bad stuff that's linked to standardized testing. One of the things that I think came out of standardized testing is that, well, if we're going to test to standardized measures, then the solution is to perform standardized teaching. Because if we're going to give everybody the same test, then surely the only way to make sure that we get adequate results is to force everybody to be taught
well,
the
then
same
we're going
way.
to grade teachers on the results of their students.
Correct.
Not where their students came from or the learning disabilities their students had.
Yep.
You're only rated as a teacher by how well your students do. So now the pressure on the teacher is to teach the test.
We've created a standardized test that we're going to assess whether or not kids are doing well by. So we've created standardized instruction. Then we've created a standardized method of evaluating teachers. I'm failing to see where there's a much human component remaining here in the process of teaching. I mean, you're asking a teacher, right, to, I guess, figure out how to interject some tiny degree of humanity into what they've been given. Because here's the prepackaged curriculum that should deliver the prepackaged result that should deliver the prepackaged student test score.
My whole problem with the science of reading, learning, teaching is an art. It's not a science. There you go. That's the biggest problem. Anytime you put science other than as a class with education, you're missing the boat. Education is not a science. It is an art. You are not working with widgets, and it's not putting widget A into slot B and it all fits. Education is an art. And if you don't allow for the freedom and the artistic on the side from the teacher and the student, the amount of learning will be limited.
Let's talk about the responsibility of schools. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. If a learning disability develops after admission, does a school still owe the student the attention and education it originally promised?
From the article, Ellis was an 8th grader at St. Anne's, an elite private school in Brooklyn Heights, and he had a lot going for him. On February 3rd, 2021, the school informed his mother by email that despite recent progress, Ellis could not return to the school for 9th grade. 3 months later, in the family home in Red Hook, Brooklyn, Ellis ended his life. He was 13. The suit pits a prestigious private school's right to select its student body against its responsibilities to the students under its care. And as Justin said, if a student develops a learning disability after being accepted, does the school still owe him the attention and education it promised? Article from the New York Times, 30 plus years as a public school teacher. Big thing out there now is school choice. Private schools, charter schools. Okay, here's your private schools, charter schools still having issues. And I want to read one more thing here. And this is from Clara Hemphill, founder of InsiderSchools.org, a guide to New York's public schools, and said that private schools counseled out students fairly regularly with few, if any, restrictions. My experience is, this is a quote, my experience is that none of the private schools do a very good job serving kids with special needs. Now, I'll take exception with that because it's never, it's never always. But then this is the part. As a generalization, and I agree with this, public schools have the will, but not the capacity. And private schools have the capacity, but not the will.
The good thing about the notion of choosing a school is this idea that sort of what we were talking about in the last segment is that education is an art, not necessarily a science. Or you could go even further and say education is a science. It's the science of the art of education. In other words, what we know works is figuring out how people learn and then matching them with people who can provide them that learning experience. So we can get the end results that we're after, right? But only if we understand what we're working with, and only if we can provide the attention necessary. So is it a science? Is it an art? Well, you could say the way we're approaching it as a science is to make it form-fitting and factory-based. But you also know, if you get into more advanced science, that science can be incredibly intricate and complicated, and that when you change one component, you can change the entire outcome. Right? Because part of what science is asking questions about what we don't know the answer to and trying to find solutions, and theories are a huge part of science, massive part of science. We don't know this for sure, but here's what we think. And now we're going to test it and figure it out. So I guess the answer is, school choice, is it good because it allows some degree of, well, my student might thrive in this environment, so therefore I can choose an environment that they can thrive in? That idea is good. What it fails to account for is that when I enter the student versus where they end up and how they end up developing, what if they don't develop as anticipated? And if we've put them in this highly selective, highly customized place that is the wrong customization for them, haven't we set up the child and the institution for failure? The worst part about all this is that a student took their own life, right? Obviously, that is the worst part. But when you look at, should we be angry at the school? Should we be upset with the parent? Should, what we do as a society, right? Who is to blame? And I'd say the blame's on society. We set up a situation that was primed to fail. We allowed the creation of an entity and a choice that was unable or unwilling, but either way, failed to adapt to a student who clearly needed help.
Okay, the headmaster who started this school back in the day, quote, to all parents coming in, our philosophy is if the student learns best under the table, then our teachers better get under the table with him. That's their mission statement. And then
they're not necessarily living up to that.
How was it that the school that prided itself on this, nurturing the talents of every student, could tell Ellis after 9 years that he no longer had a place there? And on top of it, the school does not give any grades. And it encourages kids to think outside the box and to have the ability to be artistic, write songs, those types of things. And the no grade policy has a no-nonsense record of placing graduates into elite colleges. So it works until it doesn't. As I said in the last segment, we're not working with widgets. We're working with human beings, right? And then on top of that, and this is from the article as well, suspected suicide attempts among adolescents Ellis's age are up 49% in 2021 compared with pre-pandemic levels. What moral obligation do you have to members of the human race, especially as a school, as a teacher and administrator, towards the well-being and the health of young minds?
I'd go right back to when we standardized school. What did we expect to happen? An abdication of responsibility.
Well, we've talked about this before, right? Why are schools the way they are? We're on the factory model of schools.
Right.
That's why every 45 minutes they get up, just like at the factory. You bring them in, you sit them down, you learn, you get up, you leave, you go to the next station, blah, blah, blah. You eat lunch, you do that, you go home. Why? Because that was what we did when we started.
Schools haven't always been that way, though.
Huh?
Schools and education have not always been that way.
They were with the start of the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
They went that way to create,
but they weren't like that.
Good workers.
Yeah.
Okay. But your point, they weren't that way. We've now left the Industrial Revolution, but education
that way.
has still education is still working under the premise of the Industrial Revolution model.
I wrote this down while you were talking about, a school and living up to its expectations. The only school that is right for every student is wrong for any student. If a school has promised you that it is right for every student, don't go to that school.
Because it's an impossibility.
It's just not true. It's just
it's
impossible.
An impossibility.
It's impossible. You can't.
They do their best with what they have.
Right. And that means that even back before we had standardized and institutionalized education the way that we have, were we making mistakes back then? Of course. We also weren't educating nearly as many people back then. You know what I mean? I mean, there's just a difference in volume. We weren't trying to educate the public at mass. This is a experiment. And anybody that thinks the experiment is over, you're fooling yourself. Our economy has changed. The average worker in America has changed, and we have not changed our system to reflect what we're expecting of people in a modern society. I would contend, going back to the first segment, that we would be far better served, like you said, Lance, of why are we worrying about teaching anything until a curious mind has been developed, one that can read a diverse range of literature and can read great thinkers of the past. We say we're moving toward a society where we're going to have to be thinkers because a lot of menial tasks continue to give way to automation, and we're not teaching people to think. In fact, one would contend that we're doing the opposite. We're encouraging people not to. We need these people to work and make money, and we're not teaching them how to think. We're teaching them an antiquated method that was developed 100 years ago, which worked for what it was supposed to work for. And now we're upset that it doesn't work. And it's like, well, that's because that's not what we're trying to churn out. And we're, yeah, it works great. If your intention is, to go work in a factory, then it still does a pretty decent job at preparing you to do that. And there's nothing wrong with going to do that. But the reality is that's not the majority of the American workforce. But that's how we're educating the majority of the American workforce. And then we're surprised that we're not getting good results.
Just shaking my head. Agreed.
Yep. Why do we have this show today, Lance?
Well, here at True Chat, we have a mission. And our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. You tell your coworkers and your family. And if they say, well, that sounds like a show I'd like to listen to more often and on my own, and maybe get caught up on past episodes even, tell them as a podcast. They can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us releases new episodes Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the morning as a podcast. Those same episodes are heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the United States and parts of Canada. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our associate recording producer, Levi LaForge, and senior producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.